We do have a new person come to join the panel who wasn't an initial speaker. Ivo, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Ivo, I'm the CEO, co-founder of Albert. Albert is the pocket CFO for freelancers. So we basically automate and simplify all the daily financial tasks for freelancers, which includes real-time connection with your bank accounts. We have over 40,000 users in the UK. We have the highest rated finance app in the UK. As a result of that, Apple featured us 4 times last year, so we have quite a large user base that loves what we do. For the relevance of this evening, we closed 3 funding rounds in total, 2 with a VC, Mangrove Capital, which is one of the leading European VCs. We were the early backers of Skype and Wix. They led both our rounds, and we closed 1 with them last week.
First-hand news from the trenches, fantastic, welcome. So if we come back to the shareholders agreement, it's really just an open question. You know, what's your experience with the shareholders agreement? We're going to try and get through a few questions, so I'm going to try and keep everyone to a minute or so rather than a monologue. That kind of limit. So should we perhaps start from this way and go down? If you'd like to share your own perspective on how important the shareholder is or isn't in your experience.
Super important, and the trick is to try and think of everything possible that could go wrong as well as all the things that could go right, and then more or less you'll have thought of most, if not all, of the things that you need. But it's vitally important because when you're successful, everyone wants to steal from you, and when you're unsuccessful, everyone wants to disassociate themselves with you. So you need protection when you're unsuccessful. You need to share the blame. But when you're successful, you want to share the love. But you want to share it fairly. You don't want to give more than you should be giving away. So you need to kind of plan for the divorce even before you got married, but do it properly.
Great, and I think we could probably also encourage any horror stories are as compelling as anyone saying how important it is. So please feel free to embellish any horror stories as well as any reasons for just why it's so important. Cool, should we continue?
Well, as I said previously, the most important issue about the shareholders agreement is have one. Because that is the most important. Because no matter how unsophisticated it may be in the beginning, it's something that you as shareholders, you and your partners as shareholders in the company will be working with. And if there needs to be change, you need to be changed. You can sit down and agree on many changes. But once an investor comes in, and if he sees a fairly even platform in place, no matter how close you are as partners within the business, that is a sure sign that you're serious about what you're doing. And that is quite important. So just be prepared.
What I'd like to do is just pick up on something you said earlier about the shareholder agreement and the classes of share, because we backed a company that was a spin-out from Durham University. It was 2001 they spun out, and we started funding it with private money from 2005. So between about 2005 and 2010, when it actually listed on AIM, we were involved in raising capital. And it was one of the most difficult funding rounds we've ever done, because we raised 13 million in private money, and in total they raised 22 million of private money. So it shows you what sort of product this was. However, the thing that we found when we first inherited the company was they already had 6 classes of shares. There was a long shareholder list, and the heads of agreement between everybody was just so ridiculous that it then took probably about 6 months before we could actually invest the money, because we had to simplify the classes of shares, sort out the shareholders agreement, and turn it into something that was a workable document. Because at the end of the day, it's what you say, you could put it all in the articles. There's no reason why all of those clauses couldn't be there. It's just that we don't want it to be a public document. But the thing was, it was obvious this company was on its way towards a listing, probably an AIM listing. And so we then had to do this thing, as I said earlier, start with the end in mind. Think what sort of shareholder agreement you want ready for the exit. Get rid of these classes of shares, simplify the things. And then it probably took 2 years to sort out the mess. But then we were on the journey, and by the time we got to the listing, all straightforward. So I definitely would agree with what you said there.
Cool.
Yeah, 3 key points there. Keep it very simple, the lowest cost of share. Watch out for technicalities. Make sure your drag and tag rights, for example, are carefully thought out for now and the future. And finally, never turn up in front of an investor or a lawyer without knowing actually what one should look like. And there are plenty of free ones available or ones at very low cost. Get educated with the vocabulary. Don't turn up to your lawyer saying, "What is drag and tag?" because you've had it.
Cool. Eva, any thoughts on the shareholders agreement?
I mean, the way we looked at it is documentation for us is the last step. If you are trying to reach an agreement while in the documentation process, you're doing something wrong. I think you should see an investor as a partnership. So the mutual understanding has to be before you actually go into documentation. So we always made sure that on the key points we had conversation before that. And actually when it came to the documentation phase, we already knew what on both sides was going to happen. In that way you avoid any weird conflicts at the last stage of the process.
Cool. Cool. And there's one other technical item I think a couple of people have mentioned to me they're interested to have covered. So the term sheet. Who has a term sheet in place? Cool. Well, let's begin with what is a term sheet. Should we?
Yeah. Well,
Let's go with the legal definition.
Yeah.
first thing first. A lot of people get fooled by terminology. Term sheets, you have heads of terms, letter of intent, preliminary agreement, memorandum of understanding. I had one document which was titled "Intention to Proceed," which was, it's still the same thing, and it's very difficult. I'll rephrase. It's very easy to slip into a binding agreement where you don't want it yet, and it's even easier to start doing business with no proper agreement in place and make it into a binding agreement whose terms you will absolutely hate later down the line. Even the good thing and the bad thing about common law in the jurisdiction, England, US, Canada and Australia and so on and so forth, is that you don't need a piece of paper to get bound by the terms that you agreed. It could be even, if there's any evidence of in the intention to create a contract, the likelihood is that you're going to be bitten by a proper binding agreement where you didn't have one in place and didn't want it. But generally a term sheet is a non-binding document, remember that phrase, which is, the intention of which is basically to create a moral obligation on the parties to come to a certain agreement at a later date. Despite the fact that it's called non-binding, it's actually split into 2 parts. One is non-binding, the other is binding. The non-binding part is your commercial terms. That's when you put the actual gist of what your agreement should be. And the binding part is the part where you make sure that the other party doesn't talk too much about it, confidentiality, that it talks only to you, exclusivity, and that if there's a dispute, you can go to proper court and talk about it. The main provisions about who bears the costs of the initial steps, these are just technical details which you can find when you actually draft the document. And essentially, the main thing I would say to anybody who wants to go into get firstly bound into, well, not bound, but sign a term sheet, is think what sort of commercial arrangement you want to have in place. I mean, the term sheet itself varies from deal to deal. So if you have a share purchase agreement, think what warranties you want to have on the share purchase agreement. We want to have standard warranties, or we want to have standard and this non-standard one. The shareholders agreement, again, drag and tag, reserved matters, and all the basic exits, all the main stuff, that goes into a non-binding part. But the main, as I said, the very important bit there is your behavior in this period of time when you sign the term sheet, but before you sign the main agreements based on mission base. That can change the whole game. That is the period of time you have to be very careful about. And then remember that phrases like subject to contract, or contract to be concluded later, they don't always work. Your behavior will dictate how your how your arrangement with a particular party is going to be treated. And if everything just said doesn't make any sense, ask us.
Cool, thank you. So another...
An LOI without prejudice.
LOI, it doesn't matter what you call it, really. If the agreement intends for you to have a further agreement down the line with the other party, that is a term sheet. That is what I was talking about.
It's basically the commercial terms under which an investor prepares to give you money.
It's an idea, and it creates a moral obligation. Listen, some people spend months negotiating term sheets and then just sign very quickly sign shareholders' agreements. Some really put brush strokes on a piece of paper and then only use it as a guideline. A lot of big investors tend to stick to term sheet quite religiously. So you've got to be very careful when you actually draft it, because the moral obligation is there and it's not going to be.
What I would add to that, though, is from the point of view of an investment round, if we're looking at it in that context, what we generally find is that you'll get the private equity house or venture capital will have an absolutely standard letter that they'll write to you with a couple of pages of clauses behind, which is their draft term sheet, just so you get an idea whether you can do some business, whether you're going to be anywhere near, and you can negotiate around those terms, but it's just to put something on the table, which might include an exclusivity period as well. Of course, the key thing is how long do these things last, what's the end date of that heads of agreement, and so on and so forth. So that's a protection for you as much as it is from the VC side. And as you say, then the whole point is then to move to the full contract. But that's when really you do need professional help and advice from the legal side.
Cool. I think there was a question relevant to this moment of the discussion. If you'd like to shout it so everyone can hear.
Okay, so I'm Steve Podmore. Tim, I never thought I'd say this, but I'd like to show you my testicles. So,
Well, I never thought I'd say it, but I wouldn't mind seeing it.
so what's interesting is this is FinTech for good, and it's getting inside the mind of the VC, and it's also raising money. I'm interested in how we use finance to tackle the world's toughest problems. And the venture model, many would argue, is broken. If you look at Kaufman Foundation and others, they would say is a couple of years out of date, but essentially for about 13 years out of 15, venture returns collectively are net negative to the S&P. So there are many arguments that the venture model is broken. Part of this discussion is about how things are right now. I think the promise of FinTech for good is to completely re-engineer and reinvent the venture model. There's so many gaps and barriers, there's so many challenges that prevent really important things being funded in the current scenario. Obviously, I'm working on a bit of a solution, which I won't inject into this point, but...
Might make happy families, because you two are in a similar mission, I think. No? You're on a mission to do good and stay on the journey. There you go. So you two should compare.
The mission is to unlock finance and to do it systemically around the world.
I'll see you outside in a second.
Done. Yeah. But the question essentially is, and Christoph, we met in 2013, I don't know whether you remember, but the venture model has not changed very much in 40 years. And all of the agreements that you're talking about are about protecting essentially the venture investor. It doesn't actually protect the LP. The 10-year, 220 funds, and that structure needs to change to essentially enable the risk capital to flow more efficiently. So do you see innovations in the venture community, or do you see FinTech for good coming and pulling the rug from their very pretty party that they've had for a long time?
Well, in terms of, let's just take the UK as an example, because like I said, I thought it was the best place to start, the best place to get a venture backed. Okay? If you look at it from that perspective, what I would say the UK governments in general have tried to do is simplify the process by which you can raise capital. Because you're right, as you go further along your venture, you've got people who are putting more and more barriers to you doing business. I mean, I face it every day because we have great ventures that come to us. My role is basically to be very creative with them in how we sell that to the investment community, because we want to take your plans and instead of it looking great to your customers, we want to sell you and make it look great to investors. But even with that, there can be just a scintilla of an issue, and then you're never going to get it past the door. But things are changing, for sure. I mean, for example, we're finding some ultra-high net worth individuals who are now being extremely philanthropic about coming back and backing ventures. There's so many of those that we have now in our books that we didn't have before. We're finding very specialist angel groups, which are not angel groups with people who've got 20,000 to invest. These are people who've got 200,000 to 2 million, and then they're coming together. I know of at least half a dozen of those in London, where you've probably got 50 to 90 people who can be brought together on not just philanthropic opportunities, but backing earlier stage ventures. So I'd say at the margins, it is starting to change, but it does take time because the traditional model's been here forever, and it's just going to take time for that to move. So I wouldn't say it's a revolution, but it's certainly definitely moving in the right direction.
Cool. So I've got a question probably headed for Eva at the end. I'm interested, you've got the fundraising on one hand, and then you've got the day-to-day running of the company. I wondered how these two, the interplay between the two, affects your life and that of everyone, all your colleagues.
So it probably depends. So in our case, it was a full-time job for me. So it's we're now in a post-seed stage. Basically means that, as somebody said, there's more money available, but with less investors. So you have to knock on many more doors to get the money. And that requires going through many conversations, networking, meeting people, and that's a full-time job, like in our case at least. So it costed us, I think in total, until closure, 6 months, which is normal. And for one of the founders, it is a big job. Yeah. So the team has to accept it. Your partner has to accept it, and yourself have to accept it as well. It's not a side job. No.
Great, thank you. So this is my last question before we hand over to the audience. So please do have your questions ready. It's apparent that the opportunities in the world are changing very rapidly. But by the same token, is it fair to say that risks are changing in their nature just as much? So I'd be interested in your comments, Pat, if you want to reflect on how things are different to 5 or 10 years ago, or where you think they're headed, but how are risks changing for entrepreneurs?
There's more systemic risk, which is a risk that entrepreneurs and investors cannot control. Actually, access to capital, I'd argue, is easier than it has been for even pre-financial crisis, where the flavours of capital have multiplied, which means that the investor, the entrepreneur, actually has to do more work in order to understand what it is they're after. But your opportunities to raise capital are actually greater. It's just you have to be more sophisticated. You can't just turn up and say, I need to raise money, will somebody help me? Probably it's equity. I mean, this is not going to help you at all.
Any thoughts? Risk, how it's changing?
Yeah, I mean, risks change all the time. It's part of life. It's part of evolution. So, yeah, I mean, risks are bound to change. So you just need to be aware of that as a fact that the risks are going to change. The core risk types are maybe not going to change. But if you just look at driving and car insurance, for example, I mean, there's a product that takes risk away from the driver. But if you're having driverless cars, then there's still a risk of an accident, but it's just a different risk set. Instead of it being driver liability or owner liability risk, it's suddenly becoming product liability risk. But it's still the same risk, so shit happens. So you've got to be aware that shit happens, and just try and align your recognition of the shit with the changing landscape and the evolution around you, I guess.
I can add to that. So I think if you look at the investment landscape now, I think what has been happening over the past 3 to 4 years is that there's been a widening gap between the early stage investment and the later stage investments. So in the UK, it's relatively easy. I'm not saying easy, but relatively easy compared to other markets, basically, to get early stage funding, so SEIS, EIS. But then the Series A funds get later and later. So you basically have like a Series A round now is like 5 million plus on a valuation of 10 million plus, basically. So there's a huge gap between the 150k STAS and the early A fund, and you as a company has to survive that. So basically, a seed is not a step anymore; it's a phase now, and more companies go through different seed phases, which I think is normal. It used to be frowned upon, like, oh, it's the bridge round. Now it's normal, I think, because of early Series A investors being later. So I think a big change in risk is that you need to make sure that your run rate, your burn rate, and the capability to raise investment in that phase over in the middle, that you manage that, because that's where you will not survive. That's my
Cool. Just quickly, I in the beginning of my career, I did a little bit of insurance litigation, and I remember the words of counsel. My first ever case was in House of Lords, where I just brought the coffee to my boss. But the counsel on the other side had a very interesting phrase. It was an insurance case in relation to a Greek ship owner whose ship burned down, and he said that there is no risk in this world that cannot be mitigated. It's quite an interesting concept, I think. I've learned that later down the line that he was completely correct in that. And when you talk about systemic risks, in the context of VC investment, you essentially face those together with the investor. You can still put something on paper to describe how you're going to deal with those and how you're going to take on the losses and any fallout from that. But when it comes to the internal risk of running VC, I don't think those are changing that much. And again, this is just a matter of how you prepare for them in terms of your documentation.
I was just going to add, from a purely practical point of view, and just taking the point that you just raised, it's absolutely right that gap is getting difficult. That sort of funding gap between probably 1 million and 5, in fact, probably between 1 million and 7 or 8, it's exceedingly difficult to bridge that gap. But what we are finding more and more is we see so many companies now that are keeping their business smaller and doing this cross the chasm, as I explained earlier, where they're just trying to be absolutely certain that they've considered all the risks, mitigated them, and got all the metrics together. Whereas before we might have seen companies start to grow quite slowly, move forward. It tends to be now they keep it quite tight, keep all the costs under control, and then it tends to be rather rapid growth from there on. And we're seeing that all the time in the companies that we see.
Great. So there's one risk that everybody in this room should absolutely not just accept but embrace, and that's the risk of failure. Because if you don't embrace it, you won't have a go. So you have to accept the risk of failure, embrace it, be prepared to fail, but just have a plan to do it better next time. So fail fast, fail cheap, but be prepared to fail, and you'll learn more from failure than you will from success.
Correct.
Great.
Just make sure you've got a good lawyer there too.
Fantastic. So we've run on a bit longer than we meant to, but there is still some time for questions. So who out there is tempted?
Great. So I think speaking to a lot of VCs, a lot of investors, especially on the tech front, which is very much kind of where I come from. With tech, it's easy. You sit there with a laptop, you do that for a while, send some ads on Facebook, and your user growth does this, and that's the number everyone sees. How many users you get, what's your cost per acquisition? Now with fintech, the FCA is God and tells us all what to do. So what's your advice for people that have to deal with the investors on one side and the FCA on the other, where you need to show some traction, but you need to get the authorization before you can show some traction, and that chicken egg problem, which I'm sure every single company you've come across at the early stages has to deal with?
Hire a broker. That's their job. But then you need to be listed on the market, which sounds like that, from what you've described, if you're finding that a challenge and an obstacle to your business, you would want to think about going down the public route. So thinking about the listing sooner rather than later, unless you want to sell your business out. But if that's really the issue, what you need is the intermediaries who are licensed to take that crack off your hands.
Like an authorised representative.
Well, the corporate finance house or a broker, something like that. But it depends. If you're trading shares, then yes, you want a broker on board. But then you should think about, for example, listing on a junior exchange sooner than perhaps you're imagining to. Might be well by then.
at the beginning, my advice would be you should discuss it with the VC and make it a condition. Just make sure you can get a gradual investment based on how much traction you get with every stage of the development of your business. And if FCA is what you need, you don't have to lose the VC because you don't have it. All you have to do is just make sure that he's there when you get it. And then, but it can all be put in words. You can all describe the same, or the condition of the investment, the condition of the second stage of investment, as a condition of getting more shares or losing shares, is getting your approval. Once you've done that, it's easy. It stops being a circular argument, it becomes a line. So you just go down the line.
A cheap, short way of solving that problem, if your problem is between FCA and investors and what you're doing, you might actually want to go and talk to one of the IR houses that deals with AIM-listed companies and ask them to take all this product line.
Okay.
That might be a shortcut because they are responsible for making sure you don't break the rules as well.
Are you a fan of the FCA?
It's a lot of paperwork, and I'd rather be building an awesome product and an awesome platform instead of dealing with contracts.
Yeah, but don't forget the FCA are just people, first of all, and secondly, they work for the government. Right, so all of us in this room pay tax, even if we don't pay income tax or capital gains tax. Every time we go and buy a Mars bar, we pay VAT. Yeah. So whether you live here or not, or choose to pay tax here or not, we all pay tax. Right, so we actually employ those bastards. So they're people, and they are slaves to us. And we're consumers, all of us are consumers. So they're basically there to safeguard us. So don't be afraid to go and have a chat with them.
Yeah.
Because they're people, because they work for you, you should be allowed to go and have an adult discussion with them to tell them that maybe they're wrong. Because regulators can get it wrong.
Yeah, but do be very afraid to rely on what they told you was okay if they change their mind. You need to be very concerned about that.
Okay, get it right.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask in regards to actually launching an ICO. There's been a lot of bad press in regards to ICOs. Google's obviously said that it's not going to be doing any advertising in regards to ICOs. If you're trying to build a reputable ICO, one that's actually going to help the social good of people, what would be your advice be? Would it be in regards to obviously trying to disattach from being an ICO, or actually trying to do something else altogether?
ICO is a perfectly legitimate route. It is in the end just another financial instrument, whatever it is. I mean, the SEC already know that. If you work in financial markets, it's exactly what it looks like. It's how it moves. It is one. I would say at the moment, 90% of our ICOs, for example, in China, are considered, even by other ICO issuers, to be fraudulent, essentially. The trick is to get inside a regulated envelope. There's one exchange at the moment, the Gibraltar Stock Exchange will give you a regulated envelope, and that is under the European passport for regulation, so it's a very legitimate and credible way of doing it, and the SEC will follow undoubtedly shortly. But the way to do that would be to do it under a regulated umbrella, but you will have many more disclosures. So the idea that you can pitch up an idea and say, do you know what, I'm going to issue 100 million coin for my own company, without any operational background behind it, and to verify all your assumptions, that will disappear if you do that.
The next question I want to ask is about the fact that obviously investors want to invest in a business that they know about, that they believe in, and obviously that they have the whole financial model attached in terms of business plan, financials, traction. What if you have a platform that has all the ideas, has the different tier schemes which they fall under, but you have a holding account with those actual businesses until you actually have an event that actually assists collaboration? So in regards to management team, which you all described in your pictures,
like 5 more minutes.
which you described in your pictures, having a management team, it's so hard to actually bring people on your business because it's your idea. People might be interested initially, but to actually gain that momentum over a year, 2 years, it's quite a hard task. So what would you do if, as an investor, as a VC investor, if you knew that you was investing in a company on a basis that this is the position of the company, these are the potential collaborators that would assist that company to get to the point where you need to get to, would you mind if it was in a holding facility, or would it actually prevent you from investing in that company? Sorry, would
What do you mean by holding?
So holding, so let's say you bid it for the lawyer, 2,000, 20,000, 10,000 on a potential idea, knowing that it has a wealth of collaboration behind that idea, but you didn't actually see the facilitation of that idea come to pass until you were actually...
Then it's all about the management team.
So it's like an ecosystem.
It's all about the management team, I would say. The others may disagree, but from an analyst point of view, my experience of this, and investors, VC, corporate finance, listings, it's all about the management team. And then there's an interesting thing. So we had a client who was a dentist. He was a $600 million business valuation. He has a very good relationship with this is a big team now. They have a great relationship with a major drugs company. The problem we had with him as a client was that he'd been struck off as a dentist. And his defence, although he got away with it, in our view, privately, was bullshit. Our issue was we didn't want him to be CEO. We wanted him, we said, fine, it's your idea, it's your research in the background. Yeah. Take the benefits, but please don't be CEO. He wouldn't do that, which meant that we couldn't go down the public route, so they are still a private company. So we essentially resigned that advisory. On the other hand, another client we had who came to us as CEO said, I hate being CEO. We said, that's good because you're crap at it. But what you're brilliant at is having ideas. And there are plenty of examples of these types of people. But in his case, instead of interfering and not being able to let go, he just said, I want to be on the board socially and I want the financial rewards. I want to be able to say, I'm on a board, I'm chairman, whatever, but I won't get involved as long as I can do my innovative bit. Yeah. And we said, you are perfect. Do you need help finding a CEO? No, I think I have one of those probably. And actually he did. He had somebody he was really happy to trust with him because he remained in control.
I'm just going to give you a slight analogy to help with the answers to that question if I can. We, now in the World Cup just coming up, we're getting goal line technology for the first time. Well, we were behind one of the companies that's been involved in that, but it was 29 and 2010 where their technology was first being used. We actually used it in some of the FA Cup finals around that time, and it was used on Sky Television and Setanta when they also had part of the football rights. But it's taken that amount of time to get here, get the technology there. But interestingly, when they created the technology, it didn't just work in football. It would effectively be like a replacement for Hawkeye in tennis and all sorts of other things. So the way they tried to create the company was we'll put the technology in the top code and then we'll license this technology into different sports because they thought that would allow them to maximise the investment. Of course, when we came along, we said, well, basically that's just not going to happen. You can't do that because in effect, nobody will ever put any money into the subsidiary companies because they don't own the technology. Yeah. They've got a license to use it. So just as an analogy to answer your question, every investor will always want to get to the top of the tree and invest from the top down so that then they get the maximum benefit. You won't find anybody who would really invest in a serious way in something that's just been licensed to a third party.
Okay. Cool, and that brings us to the end of time. Can we have a hand for all our panelists?